So in this video, you are going to learn about functional groups, which are really important to understanding organic chemistry and biochemistry, which you will see again in biology. So functional groups are essentially atoms that get attached to base molecules, organic molecules. So, for example, here we have propane, which is a simple organic molecule with really no functional groups in it. You can change propane into different compounds by adding different functional groups. In the case of acetone, we have a double bonded oxygen in the center, and that changes the properties of propane into something that's completely different. Similarly, with isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol, adding an oxygen and hydrogen into the center of it turns propane into something else. For these functional groups, I have prepared a table that you can use and copy down into your own notes. For those of you who are my students, I will be providing you with a copy of this too, but if you want to, you can pause and copy this down or start it and then fill it in as we go along. I'll give you a second to pause if you want to. All right, so functional groups all have names, and those names refer to a specific group of atoms that are going to be added on to the base molecule. Many of the functional groups are actually based on a simpler molecule. So for the example, the hydroxyl group, which is an oxygen and hydrogen connected to something. Oxygen and hydrogen together is 2/3 of the water molecule, HOH. So similar to water, adding an oxygen and hydrogen onto a molecule gives it similar properties. It makes that, at least that region of the molecule, polar and able to form hydrogen bonds. We call a compound that has this functional group an alcohol. And in forming the names of these alcohols, we add this, you will see the suffix "all" added to it. For example, we just talked about isopropanol. You may have heard of ethanol, glycerol. So that's how this table works. Alrighty, so rather than go through all of these, this table, which you can read yourself, I am just going to show you some examples of how they work. So, as I already mentioned, acetone has a double bonded oxygen in it. This is an example of one of two different subtypes of double bonded oxygens. It's a double bonded oxygen inside the molecule. If it were a double bonded oxygen here on one end of the molecule, it would have a slightly different name. It's not super important. The two different types of double bonded oxygens together are called carbonyl groups, but the one that's in the middle is called a keto or ketone group. They actually get their names from acetone. If you pronounce it with a hard C instead of a soft C, it's acetone, and that's where the name comes from. So this makes acetone more polar than propane, which, as you may recall from a previous video, if you've seen it, about polarity and hydrogen bonding, this makes acetone more polar and it sticks to itself. All right, the next group is the hydroxyl group. Hydroxyl groups are oxygen and hydrogens, and they turn molecules into alcohols. We've talked about rubbing alcohol before. It is polar. It makes hydrogen bonds with water. It's soluble in water. It's a liquid. Because it has these non-polar carbon and hydrogen bonds in it, it's not as polar as water, but this part of it is pretty polar. Right. Next group is an amine group. This the amine group is NH2. The amine group is based on ammonia. Ammonia is NH3. Ammonia is a base, and adding an amine group onto something will also turn it into usually a weak base. An example of methylamine that you may have encountered in your actual life is methylamine. Methylamine is a simple compound that is responsible for the sort of fishy smell to lake water. Oh, and by the way, the meth in methylamine refers to there being one carbon in it. Similarly, the prefix eth means something with two carbons in it. The formal name of this compound is ethanoic acid, but it is almost always referred to by its more common name, acetic acid. The acid group the formula is always written as COOH, but what that really means is this. Carbon double bonded to one oxygen and then single bonded to a second oxygen, which is in turn bonded to a hydrogen. So in effect, this is an aldo group, a double bonded oxygen on the end, and a hydroxyl group combined. The hydrogen in this functional group can leave the functional group as a hydrogen ion, and we may or may not have already learned that hydrogen ions in water is what makes something an acid. So carboxyl groups make their molecules acidic. So acetic acid is actually the main ingredient in vinegar that makes it vinegar. Vinegar is a solution of about 4 to 10% acetic acid in water. All right. Another example of both of these groups, amine and carboxyl groups, are the amino acids. These are the building blocks of proteins, and they get their name, as you might expect, from having both an amine group and a carboxyl group in them. This is the simplest amino acid, glycine, and you can see here it's got an amine group and a carboxyl group connected with a carbon in the center. This is the base structure for all the amino groups. One of the hydrogens is usually replaced with another functional group of different complexity, but glycine is, like I said, the simplest one. And so they're called amino acids because of the amine group and the carboxyl group, which makes them actually neutral because they have both a base and an acid group in them. The last group I'd like to mention are the thiols. This is the sulfur equivalent of a hydroxyl group. It's a sulfur and hydrogen connected to something. And this, adding a thiol, will make the molecule polar, but not really able to form hydrogen bonds. So it's not going to be as polar as something with a hydroxyl in it. And it's going to be pretty stinky. Sulfur compounds are almost always fairly smelly, and so these two thiols, compounds with sulfhydryl groups in them, are two of the three main components of the smell of skunk. All right, so that's a very quick rundown of functional groups. Again, they are groups of atoms connected to other molecules, which will give them specific properties related to what the functional group would be if it was just a molecule on its own. So if you haven't yet, please complete the table. The ones that I have starred here are the ones that I am going to emphasize the most in class. And I hope you found this informative. Thank you.